Yeah, good evening, and thank you for joining us for this reschooling lecture 1 out of 2 with Ibrahim Mahama, who just actually flew into Europe from Ghana to, first of all, curate the Vienna Biennial of Change, and then come and work with us in Berlin and stay at Callie's. And we are all very excited that you're here and that we are able to send here also from Galerie Wedding and to present our collaboration on the 1 year-long project called Existing Otherwise. My name is Solvej Ovesen. Right now I'm like a bit out of space and definitely existing somehow otherwise, as we all are at the moment. I'm in the exhibition space Galerie Wedding in Berlin. This is a place where we're right now sharing the space with the social department because of the pandemic. And we have moved our program more outwards and to collaborate with our neighbors, which is, for example, Callie's here in Berlin, a studio program, a residency program, which opened up in Lindauer Straße, which hosts Isabel Lewis, who is co-curator of Existing Otherwise, the project we will present briefly, and where Ibrahim will speak about his practice and co-curation and invitation of this art project to actually land in Ghana in his Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in 22 as an end of this long project. So this is the introduction to that, but I will just to set the context for this presentation and collaboration of this complex project, tell a little bit about the construction, and then pass the word once to present herself, Agnesa Smutzke, who is the host of Ibrahim while you are here in Berlin, and then to say 2 words about our concept, our basic idea, and for motivation for Existing Otherwise, and also for our partners. So basically, I'm the artistic director of this project, and I'm hugely inspired by the role that artists also had 100 years ago in the 1920s, 30s, where an artist who motivated me to be in art as a curator and as an artistic director, Hannah Höck, did her famous collages where she predicted a xenophobic regime appearing politically in the 20s and 30s here in Germany. She's very famous for a class called Cut with the Kitchen Knife. And that's basically talking about the new woman, and it's talking about new values. It's talking about like how the whole, let's say, ethnographic and xenophobic attitude is evolving in society in Berlin, in Germany, and how values are changing, and how she actually wants to throw that whole new ideology up in the air in her collages. And coming back to what I said in the beginning, that Ibrahim and I have been talking about in this moment of crisis, how can you actually define the role of art and of artists and us cultural producers? May we be able to contribute in a way that we, with a point of departure in ruins of structures of society that are right now actually around institutions, spaces that are not used, that because of the pandemic, because of a lot of reasons, circuits, international transport circuits not functioning, social systems, economic systems not functioning. Can we take those ruins as a point of departure? It sounds maybe a little bit rabiat or cannibalistic, but can we actually make something out of all the things that show a certain dysfunction at the moment? And I'm really literally talking about institutions that can't move or breathe, and other institutions that grow. And that's a very important question for at all talking with you, Ibrahim, about the role of art in this moment, and also radical recycling strategies. and the material change that we experience. There's a lot of people who have definitely, I think, had to revise their own consumerism. My own consumerism, I had to revise, and I think the whole recycling of what's already there, and starting with that, both in the arts and culture, which has been shut down hugely here, also in Germany, but for sure everywhere in the world struggled. Everywhere from the US to Ghana, I'm sure, but the lockdowns have been very different, had very different effects. The main question is, how can we work with change and transformation and building on top on things that didn't work? And just because I mentioned as well that I want to say something about the combination of the curatorial team for this year-long project that accumulates in Berlin and ends up in SCCA, the institution that you founded, Ibrahim, in Tamale in Ghana, and built physically, and where your studio is, and all your experiments as well, with all the materials you gather that are actually extras or monumental accumulation of material that has to do with colonialism that's been going on for centuries, and a form of exploitation and global circuit that we want to expose. And so basically, Ibrahim, I describe what you're bringing in and working with. Isabel Lewis, I'm sure you're either here or you will join later. You are our neighbor and our collaborator who also defined the Movement Research Center, which opened here in Galerie Wedding, which is an archive and a backstage for a lot of performances that will happen in public space. And you're a choreographer and also an artist and a co-host of this program, where we actually try to look into how we can create new narratives and space of also intimacy in public space, where we have gotten all used to moving on social distance terms, and we have embodied that. And the only extra space we have at this point also in Galerie Wedding is actually the public space, and that's what we have been all our common space in the last year. So that's in front of the Galerie Wedding, where the job center is, where the city hall is facing. There we have a long-term program that Isabel Lewis is programming with us, and that's very much focused on creating new relations, new quality of relations, and relations between bodies who don't know each other and are of different kinds, human and non-human. And so we have both the material, let's say, revival of materials, and we have the revival of relations on new conditions. And in that way, thinking about existing otherwise, it's both material and relational in this project. Basically, I want to say 2 words about your practice, Ibrahim, and your background, because you come out of art and you have worked a lot with architecture, a lot with space that is either unused or also from failed projects that you have then revived and given new attention to. And you have somehow found also a way to transfer that approach, that a material approach, into how you also work with and look at people. And there is not these barriers of, let's say, there's not, or let's say, let me say it positively, you see potential and meet people all around the world. And for all your projects, there's a whole community around that we are really fascinated by. And I think your approach to people also is a very, let's say, constructive one, in terms of how you work, integrate them through your work, and then create like new realities and ways of existing otherwise also for these people. So with that said, and also that you've been part of so many huge exhibitions like Documenta, and now you're curating the Vienna Biennial of Change, but you've also just won the Prinz Claus Fund for what you're doing also on an activist level. I just want to emphasize as well the importance of this whole processual project of collecting ways that we actually generate social movement at this point. It's not only choreographic movement, it's not only how we mingle in a new way with our constricted bodies, as I talked about in relation to Isabel Lewis, but it's also about how we basically how we configure space anew and recycle in extreme new ways, and find ways through maybe art to exist in a different way inside the structures that we might not be able to change immediately, but with a DIY approach can change and create communities within. Finally, I have not passed the word yet to you, Agnesa, and you're actually in Callie's in your like not far away from me, although I'm spaced out here, but you're around the corner, and I would love you to present your program where you're also hosting Isabel Lewis with her Institute for Embodied Creative Research, and then go to Ibrahim afterwards. Can I pass the word to you, Agnesa, in Callie's neighbor?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I see a full screen of people. That's very exciting. I'm sitting here at Callie's, which is a new nonprofit experimental institution in Wedding. What we do is residencies, and we try to bring local and international artists together for experimentation, intercultural connection, and also are very committed to local collaboration. So this collaboration with Galerie Wedding and Existing Otherwise is very, very dear to us. And for us, we are very new. We just started last year. It's very lovely place to start for a local collaboration. We will be hosting, I should point out, this is the first reschooling lecture by Ibrahim Mahama. There will be a second one on June 19th in person, hopefully here in our courtyard at Callie's. So you're all very, very much invited to that. And yes, Isabel Lewis is a long-term resident and collaborator with Callie's. We will also be hosting again and have been hosting Nora Chipomire, who is also part of the Existing Otherwise Cosmos. So yeah, without further ado, I'm very excited to hear the lecture. Thanks so much for organizing this, Solvej.
Yeah, thank you. And I will be very short now, but I do need to thank Kulturstiftung des Bundes, which is the main support foundation behind this project, and believing in this ambitious international project in these times, where that is in itself a kind of resistance to the COVID measures that we have to take. But I'm very grateful for that, and also for all the institutions and all the artists like believing in it. And I just want to mention that we also have an exhibition right now by Emily Hunt in the windows, and one coming up by Hannah Arnbert on the 4th. And yeah, the reschooling lecture live on the 19th of June, number 2 of your Ibrahim. Basically, I'm just so grateful that you're here and that you made it like to Europe like 2 hours ago, and you're joining us. So I'll pass the word to you, and I'll also let everyone know that please do type your questions in the chat, or say to Malte, my colleague Malte Pieper, who is here from Galerie Wedding in the Movement Research Center. And if you have a question that you want to ask also live, and he can unmute. Yeah, I'll pass the word to you, Ibrahim.
Hello. Hi. Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for being present here. And thank you very much, Solvej, and for inviting me to this project. I think we've known each other for quite some time, and we've always wanted to work together, but I think this is maybe perfect as a beginning, because I remember some years ago we were talking about you coming to Kumasi, to the university, to maybe work on the curating program, also to like give a series of lectures, but the pandemic has somehow slowed things down. So I think Existing Otherwise would be a very good starting point. And it's really exciting, this title, Existing Otherwise, when we first discussed it, because In the university where I studied at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, the idea about the program, which the new group of professors led by Dr. Caricature, was always about this idea of existing otherwise, the politics of the senses, the idea of reschooling, rethinking about what art is and the role it has to play within like the 21st century and what can come out from it. How do we, what constitutes art and how do we consume it, and how is it distributed, what form does it take, blah blah blah. So for me, those are some of the questions that I've been preoccupied with in the last couple of years, actually asking questions about what actually constitutes art and how do we actually engage with it. I guess I will go straight into the lecture or talk. Let me see if I can share the screen. Okay. Do you see the screen? Okay, great, fantastic. Let me just make it full screen and then should be good. Current slide. Okay. Okay, good. Existing otherwise is actually very important. So for me, the idea has always been to start from the point of art, because my background training is a painter. I trained as a painter at the Kwame Nkrumah University. But at the same time, the program was such a way that we had to look at architecture quite a lot, and also look at the idea of curating, because as an artist producing work, historically, we didn't really have curating as part of the program at the university. So when the new group of professors were introducing radical programs into the program, they actually had to teach artists how to somehow be able to deal with their work or curate their own exhibitions, because when we're in school, undergrad, we had to create independent art shows and everyone had to curate their own project in whatever space they could find. So the idea was always to find a space in town or in the city where you could appropriate for your work, or where a space that could inspire the ideas that you are working with. So I, over the years, became interested in like spaces around the city and also objects around the city. In time, those developed into new sensibilities, which has somehow evolved into the practice I have today. But I wanted just to start from this image of the zoom in of the jute bag, which is this material that I work with for so many years. And in the beginning, as a student, I used to do a lot of these installations around the city with this material, but I was more interested in the character of the material, because a lot of artists sometimes forget about the fact that art is also sometimes driven by economics, and just by the sheer fact that maybe an exhibition is conducted in a space or a work takes a certain form, it automatically cuts, let's say, certain audience or viewers from the work in its production or in its experience. So for me, I was very much interested in how the idea of the human condition and also capital was somehow encapsulated within like these everyday materials that we use. And this material has a long history of being used, of being produced in Southeast Asia under specific conditions and transported around the world. In Ghana, we use it in transporting cocoa. And later on, it's used in transporting other commodities like rice, maize, charcoal. And I'm interested in the character that it acquires. At some point, it almost seems like it seems started, destroyed, almost like it gives you this kind of post-apocalypse like image of something destroyed. But I'm interested in what is contained within it in terms of its history. Of course, over the years, I have used this material to produce large-scale installations, which have been shown in Venice, in Documenta, in independent shows, and in Kunst when we did An Age of Our Own Making in Denmark, among other places. But I was also interested in how this material or work could somehow convert itself back into capital, into a certain, because capital is very important to me in a way that the material which once was a container for commodities, suddenly when it's at the end of its life cycle, can somehow come back to life through art to be able to convert itself into capital. And then now the capital can be used as material for new kinds of interventions, artistic interventions. So over the years, I've been interested in looking at spaces that have existed for a long time, and also land, the idea of space and the idea of land. So one of these spaces I was looking at was these building silo brutalist architecture that was built by by Eastern Europeans in Ghana in the late 50s, early 60s, at the time of the industrialization of the continent in the Pan-Africanist age. And a lot of these projects were abandoned in the mid 60s. So I've been doing a lot of research, looking at some of them, using them for installations, but also the question of artistic responsibility, because is it just a matter of artists using spaces for interventions, or they can physically intervene within these spaces and somehow change the trajectory of these spaces? So I started thinking about these spaces as living things, like which were somehow waiting some kind of an awakening. That space, when there was one in my city in Tamale, when because it was abandoned in the mid-60s, in 66 specifically, and between 66 and 2020 during the coronavirus, no one had ever entered the building. So fishes, bats, and all kinds of species had really taken control over this space and created this new ecological system within the basement or the bunker of the building. And I thought that was quite interesting, because in the absence of human beings, life really seems to strive in a way. So for me, it's always been a question of making work that goes beyond the human experience, but at the same time also acknowledging that the space also became, it was almost like a black hole, because in my language, in Dagbani, the building was called Nkrumah Volne. Nkrumah is the name of our first president, and Nkrumah started building these because he was quite a socialist in his thinking. So when he was overthrown, there was a propaganda from the CIA saying that Nkrumah was building these spaces as political detention centers. But because the buildings were never completed, people came to believe that yes, they didn't think of them as silos or places that were meant towards the economic independence program on a continent. So they called it the Nkrumah Volne. The Vole is in my language almost sounds like a void, but it actually means a hole, like inside a hole. So it can also represent like something in the cosmos, like almost like inside a realm or a black hole or something. And when you break the word down, the end, the li, when there is something mystical about it, it's like lil in my language. When they say something has lil, it's like it's disappeared or vanished or something it's almost like a portal. So I became really interested in this idea of what art can really do at that point, like when we think of it within that manner. Yeah. So these are some images from the interior of the building, where you have like bats living in the space, like procreating. So life, toads, there were fishes, snakes, all kinds of things procreating within these spaces. So really allowing us to rethink about like space in itself and what it really does beyond the human experience in a way. So these are examples of some of the spaces. So I started thinking about making proposals to the city about converting some of these spaces into greenhouses, into like architectural spaces that could be experienced from multiple points of view, creating aquariums within them, creating conditions which allows the life within the spaces to flourish. in a way, but at the same time also intervening within those spaces to be able to unleash maybe certain potentials that existed that we wouldn't have been able to connect in a way. So in these two images on the screen, one, you find men excavating the space, because when I bought one of the buildings in the north, it had been filled with more than 50 tons of soil. Over the years, the city had tried sealing up the building, so they poured a lot of sand into it. So for me, the sand was one of the works, like one of the things in the building that needed to be looked at, because over 50 years, it had really become like this material which was so fertile that anything could grow within it, because you had catfishes and all kinds of things within it. So I had this idea of borrowing the Sputnik, the first Sputnik that was sent into orbit by the Soviets. It was gifted to the museum, our national museum. So the idea with my colleague, Salam Koji, who is the artistic director of the institution, SCCA, we had this idea of bringing the Sputnik and also this old Egyptian coffin, which is like 4,000 years old, together with like other objects into the space. And also, when we took out the soil, the idea was to turn the soil into like these bricks that could allow for the coffin to rest upon. And if you look at the top where the coffin is, there's almost this inverted pyramid at the top. And the inverted pyramid, it's a void. So light comes through it, and it's somehow it's almost like, because when the Egyptians built the pyramid, it was somehow to contain the tombs of the pharaohs and the aristocrats, but in this case you almost have the pyramid inverted in the sky, and you have like the coffin underneath it, and then the pyramid like throwing light onto it. So we're very much interested in like how like the poetics of this, and also like intervening within this crisis as it is, which has been there for decades, and somehow converting it into a space that allows for us to be able to rethink about time in itself. So we go to Red Clay, which is my studio, where I have also been working for the past couple of years, since 2015, buying land meant for agriculture, like residential, and intervening, collecting objects like airplanes which have been abandoned, and bringing them into the space and converting them into classrooms, exhibition spaces, pedagogical forms, building archives, and all kinds of things. What does it really mean? The artist, the idea of the artist studio. There's always that question, like, what does it really mean for an artist to have a studio or to make work? Is it, yeah, it's, for me, it's not, I think at an early stage of my practice, I somehow saw so much in the art world, like participating in all these major exhibitions, Documenta Venice, and I began asking myself the question, and then what? Because a lot of artists drive on the idea of success by how many international big exhibitions that they do. But I think fundamentally how we also affect art or radically change the way that its position is also very important, whether it's done in from an independent point of view or through collective means. And I try to use all of that, all of those strategies to be able to produce. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, the image is skipping fast. Yeah, so I have looked at many spaces like the railways in second Lita Crady, which I have used actually, which inspired building SCCA, the Savannah Center, in 2014 when I started working on the idea for it. So the idea of using the concept of the railway station, which came from like the late 1800s, to build this space. So crisis is always at the center of it. Sorry. Each time someone there's an admission, it freezes my video. Sorry. Yeah. So these exhibitions, for instance, so we did two major retrospectives at the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art. The first one was an older Ghanaian artist, Kofi Dawson, in 2019. And then the second one was Ajiman Osei, a 62-year-old Ghanaian artist. And like the silo, which we had to excavate, that was the point about this. So we worked with two of our colleagues, Bernard Akwe Jackson and Kwesi Oheniaye, together with Tracy Thompson and Ajuamoa, to curate these exhibitions where young people come together through the setup of, let's say, infrastructure, to be able to dig back into time, to be able to revive practices, and to be able to create new context for artistic experience. I think the image is loading. Yeah. So the idea solely was to be able to create these kinds of exhibitions. But then I'm jumping in between things, so forgive me. It's because sometimes it's so broad that I find it hard to keep track. The idea was also to be able to think about what art, the form that art also takes at the same time. So as part of my studio in Red Clay, there was a project I did in Manchester, the Parliament of Ghosts. But the question was, in building art within the context of the studio, is it a work that you stage or you build? Because I started thinking about the artworks in a more architectural sense. So like in Manchester with the image with the seats, the building is there like in any museum where an artist goes to build a work. Whereas at the studio in Tamale, I built the work into the ground. So even if a collector or someone were to buy the work would forever remain in the space. It will never go anywhere. So there are questions also regarding how objects move around, artistic forms, issues regarding repatriation, blah, blah, blah. So I started thinking really about these and like the decisions that we make around the objects and all that, artworks. What's the difference or the relationship between staging a work versus building a stage as the work itself, where many things can be staged within it? So there are mostly questions that I ask myself. So also looking at the relationship between the parliament with all these school kids in them who are experiencing the space, which is still uncompleted because they learn about the construction, but at the same time also looking at, let's say, my work of building the space and making drawings and trying to place things in it. And what's the relationship actually between the creative process of thinking, speculating versus, let's say, another generation inheriting this work. So the same idea again about these kids playing in the work, or like when it was raining, when we're casting the concrete, it collected water. So it became more like a swimming pool. So these same kids you see sitting in the parliament in the construction also become occupants of it. So the idea of the reschooling, that's it for me. These fall in the very center of it, that the idea that the artwork which we're making is no longer the sacred thing that the artist is making in the studio and then he unveils it within a grand exhibition, but the entire process and everything that it comes with it, the crisis and then the process and the community around it, the generation, everything grows up with it. Because if they're constructing a new building in MoMA or Tate, you're not going to get access to it. It's like a construction site, but there's a new way of thinking also about art and like how it works on both on an institutional level and also just as an ordinary point of view, no matter how mega or intense it seems to be. Sorry. Yeah. So this again, with these images like this, where the relationship between the parliament in use in Tamale, when we open Ajimano Says show, versus the parliament in construction. So what is the relationship between the process of building the work and the process of using the work, which is also an artistic intervention in itself each time that it happens? Yeah, so archival images have been very important to me, like going into historical images like the transportation of trains during the colonial period for colonial exploitations by the British, Germany and all that, because a lot of the trains came from multiple areas. And knowing that in the 18 something, they were actually transporting these kinds of heavy machineries for exploitation. The crisis, I like to borrow from the crisis and using that idea of the image in itself to be able to inspire me to collect these objects and work with people ordinarily, truck drivers, engineers, to transport these heavy like machines from Accra to the north where the studio is, which is about 600 kilometers away. So the logistics of even thinking about it and the imagination around it for me is also very important to the idea of the reschooling. Um, Following these journeys, sometimes with a drone, and then combining things like the river, like this is what the part of the Volta Lake, which forms the hydroelectric dam, which is connected to like the south and the industrialization of Ghana in the 60s. You never see these two images in one picture, and for me, it's very important for arts to be able to create the images that seem impossible, but in the real world. Um, and how that also appeared on as an intervention within like spaces, and how like the communities, like people drive around, go around like assisting to get these kinds of monumental things done. And like ordinarily, in terms of coming back also again to the reschooling, like in terms like what kind of imagination does it does it open, like the building that we were looking at, the silo underneath it, where I was talking about the idea of the black holes and the portals. These are very important to me, because when these events happen, it's so significant that it leaves a lasting impression in the minds of another generation, because it might never happen again, and the next time it happens, it might be 1,000 years when we're dead and gone. But the idea that it can create possibilities of new realities and new forms of thinking is very important to my thinking and to the work. Of course, it's important to in doing this, building institutions like this, to think about the human resource and infrastructure that is created around this, because the young artists who themselves are making work, but they are also interested in how they can come together to be able to work together to revive older practices and older forms. Because all the exhibitions and projects we've done so far, when you see them, they are like very good standards, like museum standards, but they are all done by like young artists and like students from the university. And by building things like this, it allows us to be able to create a new radical point from which art is perceived and also experienced by a community of practitioners and others. So this is an image from the last show in Tamale by the artist Ajimano Say. It was curated by 3 of our colleagues, Kwesi Oheniaye, Ajua Amua, and Tracy Thompson. Yeah, and Tracy Thompson is one of the artists that we are having in the biennial in Vienna. So she's due to arrive here tomorrow. Yeah. And yeah, so there are multiple sort of between the studio space. And interestingly enough, since I built this studio 5 years now, I've never used it to produce any artwork. So one might ask the question, why does an artist build a studio only to be able to use it to store archival materials or exhibitions, which allows for another generation to be able to experience art on a different level? The idea of producing new thoughts and new imaginations or new possibilities, I think, is what maybe we can be another form of response to the very capitalist-driven art world that we find ourselves in today. So that's my colleague, the artistic director of SCCA Salon. So the furniture and everything, even within the institution, is designed for workshops with school kids. So ways of interpreting the exhibitions and finding ways in which like a younger generation can somehow enter from. Yeah, so there's workshops and all kinds of things that also happens within the space. So it allows our audiences within the space in Tamale to be able to at least enter into the ideas surrounding the exhibitions and forms we're dealing with from multiple points of view in the same space where the artworks are. Yeah, so coming back to the archives again, some of there's archives in the space, and we have like all these young people coming to actually learn about the history of these archives and how they are connected to the role of infrastructure and also community building and also like preservation. And there are a lot of questions that come into being when we're taking them through these kinds of spaces which are within the institution. And that has always been the point, that at the end of the day, it's not just a matter of the artist producing the work and the work going to a big museum, but the idea that the architecture can somehow go together with the art or the objects that are made. So in most of the works that I've done in my practice, I've saved a lot of the work that I've produced. So at least all the works that I've produced, I've gifted to the institution. So in an older generation where an artist would work for maybe 20, 30 years and a museum wants to do an exhibition and they have to go around taking loans from different collections. In my studio, when you come, all the works I've done, at least 90% of them, they are there. They're gifted to the institution, and they'll be there for generations to come. So if an institution wanted to have access to these works, the works are just, they're there. They are not lost in time or anything. So we are trying to create forms that intervene within time and somehow do justice to some of the injustices that were done. But at the same time, there are a lot of important decisions that we have to make within our time as artists, and how we also introduce a very young generation into maybe more radical ideas that would somehow avert some of the older conditions that we inherited as artists. These are the last images of like the fuselage and the cockpit of the airplane, where we use them as classrooms, drawing sessions, frottage, collages, whatever. So the idea that technology can somehow be able to influence the imagination and thinking by combining, let's say, drone tech together with, let's say, the cockpit of an airplane, it creates some kind of technological singularity and also creates the idea of singularity, bringing two different objects from different timelines into to occupy the same space. And if it collapses, sometimes people ask the questions, and then what? But when you find yourself being sucked into a black hole, you don't have time to ask, and then what? I think at that point, there is an infinite possibilities. You could be sucked into another multiverse, or you could be sucked into your death or whatever. But whatever be the case, at least there is a transition with the body. And for me, the transition is with the mind and the imagination within this generation. And because we've always complained that the reason why the world is in the position that it's in is because of the lack of imagination and thinking. And I think that if we are able to create ideas and programs, even born out of the failures that we currently inherit, at least we admit that this is where we are, and we also have to admit that this is where we want to be. But if we're in constant denial of the truth or the conditions under which the planet is in, we will never really get anywhere. So I also like to draw the relationship between, for instance, using the cockpit as a classroom versus going into communities and then using the same classrooms, going with TV sets or projectors, and then doing the same workshops or classes with them. So in a way that these kids, they inhabit these two different spaces and two different sets of conditions. So they're able to really migrate the way they experience the world in between these two spaces. The same like with the drone workshops, like presenting these forms, introducing them to these technologies through art, because they come to the institution, they go through the silo, they see the coffin, they go to the building, they see these exhibitions of videos paintings, blah, blah, blah. They experience drone in relation to the landscape, blah, blah. So at the end of the day, how does it really shape the way they think about the position of art? For me, it's very important. And you can always see it in their face, because I could have, the institution could have existed, for instance, in Accra, where the capital is, where everyone thinks that, oh, the people there are a bit more sophisticated, blah, blah. But no, it's in Tamale, and more so in a rural context, because the idea has always been to start from ground zero, to start from the places where we would ordinarily not think that we should invest time into these spaces and introduce another generation. It's almost like a gift, because life in itself is a gift in a way. So we have to be able to at least push ideas within a direction that ignites new kinds of imaginations. Oh, I'm trying to, okay. So yeah, so these so an image like this, there is the next image is quite, and I zoom into one of these into like a section, and you can see some of the kids, like they, like even the little ones, they are it's like every pocket, like the tiniest pocket of spaces, they're trying to really catch a glimpse of what might represent their future in terms of thinking. And you'll be surprised that some of these kids, like in these communities, when you go there to actually talk to them about art and technology or things like that, some of them, you mention things like train, and they don't even know what a train is, because they've never seen it, and secondly, also a lot of them might have parents who don't have, because they come from farming communities, who might not have television. So if I don't see an object, how do I imagine it? So for me, imagination is very important, because I think that imagination would be one of the things that would also help us to be able to navigate capital and also the conditions that we've created for ourselves. Beyond the idea of monetizing the world, we can also find new experiences or ways which can elevate like life beyond just thinking about constantly consuming the earth and its resources that it has. So this is the last image. The idea is that it's produced that these reschooling workshops or interventions within like within the institution as a thing in itself, as a practice in itself, can get to a point where a younger generation can somehow be able to take their destiny into their own hands, the idea of self-determination, to be able to forge new ways of thinking about the way they will experience the world in relation to the land that they find themselves in. Because you see in a picture that sometimes there are sheep in the background. So this is like just a normal like rural farming community where you have kids who go to school, come back home, like any other place in the world. But the idea that there are certain opportunities through art that allows them to be able to navigate or experience the world in different ways, that changes the way that their brain is constituted. So when the premises of art doesn't really start from the same premises that maybe the art world would be operating with, that maybe the premises of art for them will be a lot more sophisticated, because at the end of the day, they'll be thinking about it in relation to how the constitution of life itself, and not thinking about the value of an object in relation to an institution or something like that. Yeah. So that's it.
Thank you, Ibrahim. You're so awake, although you were traveling all night, and I'm grateful that we are brought to Tamale straight away. I know that Isabel has a question. I can already see it. I'll pass the word to Isabel Lewis Malte. Can you unmute her?
Hello, Ibrahim and everyone. Ibrahim, thank you so much. I actually didn't have a question prepared. I was more clapping my hands as a reaction. However, I just maybe will comment that it's so exciting to see what you're doing, and I really relate to and believe in this emphasis on the imagination, and and working with imagination to kind of dream up alternative formats. And often, maybe this happens to you too, and when you said that the question comes to you as an artist, and then what? I often also get asked these kinds of questions. For example, what are you about? Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, you experiment with format, you do this and that, you work in this mode and that mode, you create different kinds of situations, and people are looking for sort of one thematic aspect that I'm interested in, and it's so strange because my interests are vast and the imagination goes in all directions. I'm always interested in learning, but I think that this emphasis on alternative formats is very much about stretching the imagination and stretching the possibilities of what art can do, how art can potentially hold a space for social transformation, but it requires, therefore, new modes of storytelling, new modes of social interaction, new formats for expression and display in order to tell the new kinds of stories that we're going to need for our human survival and flourishing, hopefully in a greener, more ethical way in relation to this planet. So yeah, thank you, Ibrahim. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed your reschooling today.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's Ibrahim, do you have an immediate response? I love that you talked so much about reschooling as well. Comment about that.
No, for me, it's always been important, and it's not just for me, but it's also for my generation from the university in Kumasi, because we are constantly trying to find. I wouldn't call it radical per se, because there are more radical forms which are yet to emerge. But I guess we are constantly trying to find forms that can somehow allow us ways to transition from the older ways in which practices were somehow striving or operating. So for me, it's important to be able to at least create this practice as I go along, because I honestly don't know how I do it, and I don't have a strategy. I just have a sense of conviction, and I have ideas, and I don't limit myself, and I just do things as and when I think that they need to be done. If not, 6 years on, I would have abandoned working like this, because it can be very difficult, but it's also very promising, and it's as shown that we can actually have many different points of departure in the way that we produce art and the way it's experienced and shared. So
Ibrahim, you said in the beginning you're really interested in forms of production, and I mean, it's both in a historical way, the traces modernism left, and the ways materials have been treated. But I mean, if you look at it now, and we've been talking about like how are the conditions of production now, when I mean, half a year ago you said you thought the world should be on have a whole sabbatical year every 5 years. You know, we just were all in parentheses and on hold. And is there something that changed in regards to your idea of production, or how you observe the notion of production change, also the values behind it? And I mean, I'm already, of course, I think thinking and indicating that it might have changed, and we are digesting, and regeneration might, or recycling might be production or thinking. That's what I think the discourse is trying also to suggest, like when you can't do much, when you're working in a limited space as a citizen or as a creative person.
yeah, no, it's interesting, honestly, because in the last 1 year, I have resolved so much in my head than I have in my whole practice as an artist. I came to many, not conclusions, but I came to many ideas and terms that for many years as an artist, constantly traveling in between spaces, it was very difficult for me to be able to see exactly what I was doing. I knew I wanted to do something as an artist, but I never really had any proper clear sense of direction. So the last 1 year of just staying home during the pandemic, it was that same period that I excavated this old architectural space, the silo, where the coffin and the Sputnik and the moon rock and like all these spaces, like we're able to create all these conversations. Before it was very slow work, like just working, going to the space every day and working with young people with a shovel and a bucket, to almost like you've traveled back in time, like to be with like archaeologists trying to dig out something from the earth, you know. But it was very slow, but very, very important in a way that it gives a lot of time for us to be able to really think about what we have to do. And I somehow imagine that and now of course, after having this experience and being able to do some of this work, I think that it's possible to be able to apply it to other spaces, similar spaces that exist, that have been totally abandoned, or that need some kind of urgent interventions that can help us to be able to like continue this idea of this reschooling that we're dealing with. But without having that slow time in the last 1 year, I don't think I would have been able to arrive at this point of thinking and articulating the ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I follow I think we're in a sign of regeneration and reflection for sure, and that's like the form of production. I'm thinking about so many real, let's say, commercial routes and exchanges that are actually changing also. Like you're for the first time arriving now in Europe, and we have a lot of delayed or minimized travel, and most of us we have a schedule that's like, it becomes very important, the one trip you choose to do, I think automatically at this point. And I have a question to you, because I always felt we understood ecology, we understood each other, but we understood different, let's say, key points as being priority in thinking ecology. And now that you're working both with the biennial in Vienna on that subject, and also talking about it in relation to your local project in Tamale, and we are in a different way also talking about it in Existing Otherwise. I mean, in many ways, we're also in this project we have together talking about the automatic from outside coming limitations, where we need to as individuals experiment with our freedoms, and also find other ways that we can sustain and adapt as humans. Can you give a pitch about like what's your main consideration in terms of, let's say, an ecological way of existing otherwise? I have the feeling we always in the West think about how many flights are happening, you know, how much clothes is someone buying, like where do people eat food from, what does it, what's the main concern for you? I mean, you started with the jute sacks and the exportation of all the resources throughout such a long time from Ghana to elsewhere. I have the feeling you have another global understanding of ecology.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, for me, I think fundamentally it comes down to the idea that whatever we produce, it's not I've always had this idea that whatever you produce doesn't necessarily mean that it belongs to you. Because in the age of capital and individualism, if an artist produces a work with his labor or with the labor of other people that he's paid, then he's entitled to it. Of course, I've used it in my work in terms of like converting it, like working with assistants, converting the work into capital. But that was what I was talking about in the beginning, that at the end of the day, it makes in a more ecological sense, and also from a more political position, it makes more sense to be able to redistribute that in a form of, let's say, making other interventions. And it allows for many things to come to life. So for instance, reviving these older spaces or intervening within land, because in Tamale, I bought a lot of land that was meant actually for agriculture, which normally they would normally they would turn into, let's say, residential blocks, or which they would or land that is meant for institutional projects like schools in communities, which they would then destroy, or the silo, for instance, which was meant as a public space, but then it is privatized and then it is lost, it is out of the public realm. The idea of using collective labor through and converting it into capital and somehow using it to invest into areas which allows us to be able to reinforce our notions on public spaces and collectivity and all that. And I think in the longer term, and in this case, it doesn't go back to the conversation of the NGO, which comes back down to the idea of global exploitation and excess capital and surpluses, which are used in funding institutions that somehow always try to teach us about ways in which we should exist within our communities and spaces. So for me, it's very important that at least in the way that we think about artistic production, we have to be not just ethical or moral, but there is a certain sense of responsibility that comes with it, that we have to factor it into the ways that we operate. Yeah.
Great, a great manifesto to remember to give away your artwork, keep it open, make access, and yeah, beautiful. Do more people have comments or questions, because we are coming towards an end, and the second round of your sharing of knowledge and experiences will be possible to experience live at Callie's on the 19th of June in the backyard. And yeah, I wonder if anyone is gonna take the chance in the last round of to pose their question. And yeah, meanwhile, Agnesa.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim. This was very, very inspiring. I took a lot of notes. And one of the notes is what I think I'll keep in mind is what you said about staging a work versus creating the work as the stage, and like creating really like generative space where things can happen. And I think it's very inspiring how you have the next generation already as part of your thinking and creating something that can last many, many years. I was just curious, maybe you could tell a little bit more about the different communities that you work with. You mentioned young artists from the local universities, but there's also international artists, and there's school kids. Maybe you could just give a little bit of insight how these different communities come together and how they influence each other, how they work together. I'd be very curious to hear.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the first part is the community of workers or people we work with in the institution. So from the local craftsmen in the city, masons, carpenters, whom we've worked with for the last 6 to 7 years. We also have like a group of carpenters and skilled labor who also come from Accra to help us to build some specific parts of the institution. Of course, we have, though we operate independently, but we also write letters through the education ministry to invite schools from different communities, both in the rural setting and also schools from like the inner parts of the city. And we also go to these schools anyway. So the workshop, we do a lot of workshops, either independent workshops with them, or we design workshops out of the existing exhibitions that are there. And these exhibitions, there might be paintings or sculptures or photography or something within the exhibition that we might maybe result in using local techniques of, let's say, painting or maybe extracting oil or pigment from a rock or bark of a tree by cooking it or something to be able to produce. In the north of Ghana, there is very north, there is a place called Siregu. It's an old town. It's more than 500 years old. And historically, it's a place where the women used to make paintings on the wall, inspired by folklore and storytelling. And the men would maybe mix the mud or things like that, do the building, whilst the women painted the building. And there's just, the tradition is still there, but it is gradually dying out. I did my BFA thesis on that space. So recently, in the last exhibition, the artist Ajman Osei wanted to work with these local artists in making a mural as part of his projects in the north. So it was one of the workshops that we organized. So we brought the women from the upper north, where they worked with people locally to crush the earth like bricks, the same materials for the architecture and other pigments locally, and then they used it in making these murals. And then we also, some of the images that you saw, we work with the school kids actually in doing these murals. And also the people coming from the university, the young artists, they're very influential. What I've seen over the last just the last 2 years is that ordinarily people were not, of course, there was never a real introduction into art in this depth. And now you have like engineers or scientists or doctors who are bringing their children to the institution actually for art classes or for workshops or things like that, because suddenly they have come to believe and understand that their idea about art all these years has been wrong, and the starting point of art, let's say, is imagination, and technology or medicine or anything can play a role within that. So even when we have, for instance, we're working on a show and there is an injury or something, we can easily just call one of the doctors and they will stop everything they're doing to attend to one of the members in our community. So I think it's important because it's created a new, like an ecosystem where one thing influences or inspires the other. So like the local carpenters, the artists can learn from them. The kids can actually learn from the way that the local carpenters produce things. And myself, I always produce that way in my work. So some of the workshops that we designed, for instance, we're thinking, how do we bring repairers, TV repairers or radio repairers into the space? How do they, can they, the local, like the knowledge that they have, which is international in terms of like repairing motherboards or motors within like an old cassette players, how can we interpret that into another form, which can allow for maybe the kids to maybe enter into the technology in a very different way, in as much as they draw it, but is it also possible that they can also understand it into a much more technological stage? So that was what I was talking about, the fact that there is no end to it. All I see is possibility. And at the end of the day, it's just a matter of creating the necessary condition that allows for all of these to flourish, because the kids will learn something, and also the guy who is the repairer also would learn a very different position in which his thinking would also change in a way that he would have ordinarily thought that, oh, he's just repairing a computer or a TV, but now he knows that it's by entering into the technology of the TV to repair, there is something that he does, or he leaves a stain within it, which almost like he's also contributing to the way that technology functions and the way the world operates. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was an amazing question, Agnes, and it's very important to understand the ecology in the community and how development happens. And I have to think of how Documenta and Castle developed from 1955, when everything was in ruins and Europe's biggest museum was in ruins. And Arnold Bode, the founder, he wanted to invite artists to propose sculptures to exhibit in the ruins, and then generate new images of what a human can be after the Arya, after the white man. And I think the whole process of gathering people and accessing communities is actually a skill that belongs to this, let's say, new kind of production that is important. And then also skills of making access and skills of finding new uses for space. A lot of things that you do is something we need to learn from all around, and also have to practice. And so reschooling is all about accepting these unknown competences that we need to acquire, and what it actually means somehow, yeah, how evolution happens. I can't show this book here because I'm I'm not in front of yeah, no, like some key questions to our human existence about how evolution happens and how we are actually living this little nanosecond of it. And I would just invite everyone to join for your second lecture, Ibrahim, and just thank all of you for being with us, and you especially, Ibrahim, for making it even on time, like coming over 4 airports. And welcome to Europe. I hope your biennial will be amazing, and everyone can follow Vienna Biennial for Change 2021. And I also want to thank my colleagues here and you, Isabel, for attending, and also for your whole creation of this Existing Otherwise, introducing the book by Saidaya Hartman. And I hope we can develop the discourse on why we have that concept actually, and what it also means, and in relation to finding and experimenting with freedom, and how we can translate it to today and learn, to be honest, also from history and from Afro-American girls and women who already in the 1900s and onwards found ways to breathe inside like very, very tight structures, societal structures. And I would like to round off from today and tonight, and wish everyone a happy opening and even an interesting weekend maybe in front. And just thank you, Malte Pieper from our curatorial team here in Galerie, from the Movement Research Center, and tell everyone else to come by on the 4th of June, where we have the next opening here in Galerie, with Hannah Arnberg on the subject of work after work, what it means, and costumes for new ways of working or not working, which we'll show here in performance. Thanks for joining, everyone, and see you maybe on the 19th. Yeah, big hugs, Ibrahim.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, thank you to Callie and Jared, Gregory, for hosting Ibrahim. And I round off here. Bye-bye.